knocker will be sounded after the first and after the 7th minute. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. It is now my pleasure to welcome Ariana to open the debate. The first speaker of proposition to open the debate.
Steve Jobs said, "If someone at Apple can dream it up, we should patent it, because even if we never use it, it's a defensive tool." Policies like this one may have earned Mr. Jobs billions of dollars. Unfortunately, that came at the price of those whose hard work he repressed and those whose basic needs he left unmet. Team Wales will bring to you a 3-part case today. Firstly, about how patent law is an unjust means of allocating property. Second of all, about how current patent law stifles access to vital technology. And third, my second speaker will be talking about how our model boosts innovation. So onto our mechanism. The technology industry is made up of a number of markets, such as communications and social media. To companies under this model, we would withdraw patent protection rights from them by publishing any patents they hold at the patent office and forbidding the prosecution of anyone who adapts or profits from them. The second part is about what constitutes a significant market share. So this will vary from market to market, and we trust competition authorities to decide the exact percentage on a case-by-case basis. Thirdly, we recognize that wholly new markets sometimes emerge, where the first company ends up with a very large market share. We would grant these markets a grace period of 2 years to encourage healthy competition, after which we would apply our policy. Fourthly, we would support and would improve upon all legislation on corporate fraud and evasion. So if a company sets up a shell company to hold patents on its behalf, we will strip these patents of their protection. Fifthly, government firms, that are developing technology for national security interests are obviously exempt from our policy. Yes?
Would you still allow these companies to apply for copyright protection?
We think that copyright and patents are a very different case. However, it aligns with our principle, and we see that small companies are being restricted. We're fine with that, yes. So, firstly, patent law is an unjust means of allocating property. Within society, we have established a general concept of property rights because we recognize it's important for people to legally protect and own the things that they worked hard for. However, the current system of patent registration is so hopelessly flawed that it actively obstructs access to property rights for all but the richest within society. So why is this the case, ladies and gentlemen? The uncertainty inherent in patent law, no thank you, means that it overwhelmingly favors those who fight protracted legal battles as opposed to those who truly deserve its rewards. Patent law usually sets in stone incredibly vague definitions for ideas or concepts. Apple alone have patented the 5th dimension and human input into a computer, even though these are incredibly ambiguous and fairly intangible. Note that this problem is inherent to all patent law, which necessarily sets out and defines concepts which do not yet exist and are undefined as a result. So why does this matter? It matters because the power to interpret and define the vague concepts rests with the companies who employ the most lawyers, who are the best able to secure favorable rulings in circuit courts. What this means is that property rights under patent law, no thank you, are incredibly difficult to define and defend. As a result, they tend to be vacuumed up by rich companies with wealthy lawyers. There is no protection for the little guy in a world that so heavily favors the wealthy. When the rich use laws and lawyers to beat off any hope of fair competition, we say it is time to scrap these laws. No thank you. The first and most obvious benefit is that we unleash the potential of every single startup company which is currently suppressed by corporations. The next Mark Zuckerberg or the next Steve Wozniak will be freed from the threat of large litigations and free to develop the generation of new technological advantages. No thank you. However, perhaps more importantly, we will free up every piece of potential that Apple has selfishly stashed, such as the 50,000 patents Apple is currently hoarding that will now be released into the market. So why is this a good thing? Obviously, this means that the technology will be replicated by companies which can sell it to the consumer, no thank you, at prices kept low by international competition.
Madam?
No thank you. We want everyone on Earth to have faster processing, to have access to the communication that gives jobs and opportunities to everyone. but we say that this is far more likely in a world, no thank you, where companies are competing to offer the lowest prices on a new smartphone, for example. However, perhaps most importantly, the release of old ideas will spur on the creation of new ones, because a lot of innovation happens when companies of existing products and ideas develop them further. For example, Samsung has been trying to develop Apple's heart sensors. We tell you that what is important in this debate, no thank you, is that small companies are actively hounded from the patent market by current legislation and law enforcement.
Points of information.
No thank you. As a small company, you're unlikely to even apply for a patent, because startups with limited funds can rarely afford multiple applications, which means that compared to large companies who can bombard the patent offices, the patents for smaller companies are lost for months at a time in offices that are overloaded.
Points of information.
No thank you. Secondly, if the small company manages to receive a patent, the larger company can use the appeal system to stymie the patent at every turn, exploiting the massive budgets to overturn unfavorable judgments. Even if these obstacles fail to obliterate a patent, these large companies will intimidate small firms through threats and litigations, no thank you, to prevent them from keeping their patents. For a claim that could be worth less, no thank you, than $1 million, a total litigation can sum $2.5 million. Patent law, then, does not protect the property of small companies. It simply reassigns it to the wealthy. Until we end the ability of large corporations to use their patents as sticks to beat off the disadvantage, we will never see an end to this injustice. Yes?
Madam, why should I care about an iPhone becoming now a few $100s cheaper? What is it that I, as an individual, am going to gain from this?
We think that society, and individuals, have a clear benefit. Thus, obviously, it'll be cheaper for poorer people to access this technology, bettering the developing world, boosting our economy, and increasing productivity. Now I will move on to my second point of substantive on why current patent law suppresses vital technology. So we've already told you that corporations can use patent protection to brutally repress innovation by smaller companies. Unfortunately, this problem is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many more reasons, no thank you, why patent law results in the suppression of important, sometimes life-saving technology. I want to start by talking about defensive patenting and patent hoarding. So what we mean by defensive patenting is when large companies file patents not to develop them, but just to deny them to others. Companies like Apple will patent anything which they think, even if they don't know how to develop it, as I said in the quote earlier. The results of this are clear. 1/3 of patents owned by large companies are unused as of 2013. The race to hoard patents, no thank you, to stash them away from consumers is escalating. In 2014, Apple acquired 2,004 patents, of which only 212 were actually used. While Mr. Jobs may have made millions and billions of dollars off of strategies such as these, we frankly would prefer, no thank you, this technology to end up in the hands of those who need it most, no thank you. More importantly, we say that there are systemic reasons why companies hoard patents, will never release them onto the market, no thank you. Sure, it might make some money in the short term, but we have a number of incentives that mean that this will outweigh the benefits. For instance, if a company has developed a phone which outstrips the competitors, its best strategy isn't to release the phone immediately, but to stock it up and release it incrementally in order to increase the most amount of profit. That way people are buying 10 phones rather than one. We see this in the example of Intel producing 6 processors and not actually releasing any of them to the market. So now I've proved to you how patent protections are abused by big countries. Let's talk about the benefits of their removal. Let's talk about how we increase innovation on our side of the house. Incorporating them into smartphones so people can check their physical health is an important part, a very important part of how technology occurs. Other companies have dreamed of improving Uber's location technology in order to make things safer, in order to benefit medical emergencies. You don't need a factory or an investor to rewrite vital pieces of code, and we want to end the restrictions that stop companies from doing this and see these ideas thrive when developed by the full genius of the international market. At the end of this speech, we see a world in which ideas are owned by all, at a cheaper price, in ways which allow the future of development. This important motion absolutely must stand so everyone can have an equal chance and right to property, and we are so proud to propose.
Thank you, Ariana, for your speech. Your speaking time was 8 minutes and 10 seconds. I'd now like to ask David to give his speech.
there's a crucial and underlying premise in favour of patents. It incentivises innovation. Removing the right to patents from those who have the most capacity, know-how, knowledge, and actual will to innovate new technologies that can reshape the world as we know it is going to be crucial and detrimental to long-term innovation. That is why we oppose today the policy T proposition stands for. I want to bring two arguments in this debate. First of all, talk about risk and reward in terms of incentivizing innovation. Secondly, information sharing. Carl is going to extend our case by talking about capacity to innovate. But before I move on to substantive, rebuttal and frame line. So in terms of the model, right, this model will essentially fail because companies will find alternative ways to protect their intellectual property, numerous ways. First of all, they can still sue companies that copy their product, right? Current competition law states that if another company comes in with the exact same product you have, you can essentially sue them without having a patent. Secondly, you can protect your IP via copyright protection, and if they abolish copyright protection, we think you can essentially copy the entire Samsung brand, which is really, really horrible for those companies, which will essentially bankrupt them if that is what will happen, right? Thirdly, you can use utility models, which are essentially like patents, but are easier to acquire and overthrow. Fourth, they will resort to using trade secrets, such as Google not patenting their search engine algorithm, but rather using it as a trade secret. So due to this, they will not get any benefit. And we think they have three burdens in this debate specifically. First of all, that to show us this abuse that they talk about is systematic and inherent to every company they are going to talk about. Secondly, they have to show us why technological companies. And thirdly, they have to show us why technological companies with significant market shares. That's the burdens they have to prove to us. But talking about the currently existing loopholes and broken policies that they so outline, we think there are numerous ways to counteract these problems, right? First of all, abuse of dominance is already tackled by compulsory licensing. What that means is, if a company is hoarding patents and not using them, we can force them to license out those patents to certain companies, such as how the European Commission has forced Intel and Microsoft to give out certain patents. We think this mechanism can also be used in terms of the second argument about how they hoard patents and do nothing with them, right? This tackles that. Secondly, legislation is still catching up with new phenomena such as patent trolling, right? The first law about patent trolling was implemented in 2013 in the US. The patent system needs reforming and it's being done right now. We obviously can't do this policy just because small companies are hindered in some effect. Go.
Do you support legislation to break up monopolies?
Yes, we do think breaking up monopolies is good, and if you want to talk about that, we can deal with this. We don't think that technological monopolies in terms are always inherently harmful. We think if they want to talk about that, they have to prove it. But in terms of the criteria, right, we think that the criteria for this debate is simple. It's long-term innovation, because long-term innovation is something that the patent system is designed around, and it's the main purpose of what it aims to fulfill, right? So, if you want to talk about that, we need to see it from that perspective, right? In terms of quick rebuttal. So in the first argument tells us like the patent registries are flawed and small companies are being damaged, right? We think if big companies who are big shareholders, right, big market leaders, they can still do any type of litigation to these small companies to keep them out of the market, right? If that is what they want to do, they can still do it. We don't think it's going to be necessarily beneficial through this policy only. If this is going to damage innovation, then a comparative of like small companies having one area of less litigation versus not having any innovation is not worth it, right? Secondly, why is this necessary? We're seeing the biggest boom of innovation in the world, in the technological world. The startup industry is a totally new phenomenon which has never existed before. We think it's beneficial that this exists, right? Well, it exists already, so we don't see the necessity of why this is necessary. Secondly, this entire mechanization of how they will now be able to operate on this market is incredibly vague, right? They never provide us a clear mechanism of how abolishing one big harm that they currently have will allow them to entirely operate on that market. We need more substantive from them on that part. Moving on to substantive, right? So risk and reward. The crucial premise for innovation is investment, and the calculus companies make today is whether or not the risk they put into investments for certain innovations will pay off in the long term, right? With the reward they will get. This balance will be dramatically shifted towards having more risk and less potential reward. Therefore, investments into innovation will be reduced. Even in the status quo, there are certain risks companies have to take in terms of innovation. First of all, they have to acknowledge the fact that other companies might come up with a better alternative solution than what they are proposing, right? Secondly, they have to acknowledge the fact that in the next 20 years, their product might not become profitable. These are two huge risks that are currently in place today when you do large-scale innovation. This will be even more, no thank you, but no thank you. This will be even more dramatically shifted because they will have additional risks that those companies will now have to take. Other companies, if they even more, if they protect like abolishing copyright and trademarks, will now essentially can come into the same market, entirely copy their product and sell it for cheaper. Why is that? Because they don't have to charge a premium, and they essentially concede to that in the first point, right? For example, a regular wind turbine, an industrial level wind turbine costs $2 million, right? 10% of that usually is a premium to balance out R&D costs, right? That's $100,000. If another company can come and sell their wind turbine for example $1.9 million, you will lose like millions of dollars because you sell loads of them, right? That will mean you have less capacity and less incentive to innovate because you never get an insured profit for that, right? This hinders innovation by two ways. First of all, you remove the incentive to innovate in the first place due to not having an insured profit. Secondly, it disincentivizes coming up with new alternative solutions to current products to enter certain markets. For example, if Google had lost all their patents to self-driving cars, Tesla could have stolen everything Google had produced up to this point, rather than find new innovative ways to come up into the market and to develop their own self-driving car. We think this is crucial for large-scale investment.
On that point,
secondly, we think it's more prevalent for large-scale innovations, such as IBM's investment into synthetic brains, which is $3 billion. It's really hard to justify that to shareholders when you can say, well, we don't know, another startup can come up and steal our entire invention and sell it for cheaper, right? They can't sell that to the shareholder, and it's going to be immensely problematic in terms of long-term innovation on a huge project. No, thank you. So, less innovation, we think it's important. Talking about information sharing, right? Today, the patent system forces you to disclose all information up to the point that that certain product could be reproduced. And we need to look at it from the way the patents wants to fulfill two criteria. First of all, to incentivize innovation, and secondly, to share information to the world. It's essentially a balance between those two. Now, in these cases, companies will start using trade secrets instead of patents. The reason for that is, what a trade secret essentially is, you do nothing. You just keep that entire formula or algorithm for Google search engine, which they currently do, to yourself. You never reveal it to anyone. What they currently do with most technology, though, is they put it in a patent registry and everyone can see it in the world, but they can't copy it, right? For example, 80% of technologically related information is only available in patent registries, right? At this point in time, we have seen the massive impacts of what Google search engine algorithm being hidden has done. It's one of the most powerful tools for learning how information is spread, how information can be found on the internet, right? But nobody knows what is in it, and nobody can innovate based on that currently existing technology. What will happen now is, because companies will want to protect their intellectual property in some form, because patents provide them nothing, they will do it even on a larger scale. They will never tell anyone what is in their product. They will never tell anyone how that know-how or the know-how that they can get from the patent system right now. For example, 88% of US, European and Japanese companies use the patent system to direct their own R&D investments and to know technological advances, right? These statistics of 80% of technology-related information only being available in patent registries, and secondly, of how these companies do it, we can see that obviously companies will not have access to the information that they say is so important. We think if the small-term benefit of having cheaper prices is good, is not comparable to how long-term innovation is going to be harmed through this policy. For all of those reasons, we think this policy will not be beneficial, and for those reasons, we beg you to oppose.
Thank you, Jan, for your speech. Your speaking time was 8 minutes and 23 seconds. I'd now like to call David to give his speech.
I want to make one thing very clear. There is an incredibly important principle in this debate, which is that if we have property rights within society, we must try to distribute them as equally as possible. That is the only just way of distributing rights, and is the only thing that happens that Team Estonia frankly just didn't want to engage with, right? They pin their entire case on some analysis about long-term innovation, which we will show how it gets better in our side of the house, is more sustained, and is more accelerated. We'll also deal with a lot of the stuff that they responded to inadequately. So what am I going to do in this speech? I'm going to bring you a third piece of substantive case regarding long-term innovation. I'll be integrating a rebuttal to what we hear from them in the first speech in that issue. Before that, two things. I first of all want to discuss the model, and then I want to discuss the principles. So first of all, the model. What objections did they have? They basically said that there were other problems that existed that we ought to get rid of also. I mean, they told us that if you have a product that's exactly the same thing as another company, you are able to sue that company for stealing your product. We say, like, fine, we're happy to get rid of that regulation if that is the case for the large companies. That's not a problem. They told us about utility models, which are effectively the same thing. Well, if they're effectively the same thing, we'll effectively get rid of them. So we don't see why that's a big problem either. There was nothing fundamental there to derail our case. They told us about trade secrets, which they then expanded on later. I will engage with trade secrets and show you how we've already realised that is likely to happen and how we have responses to that. We will get onto that when we discuss long-term innovation. So those are the objections to their model. They told us what their solution to the problem was. Compulsory licensing. Why is this problematic? Because they ran their entire case on long-term innovation, and then they said, but companies will definitely keep innovating. If the moment they've spent 10 years and billions of dollars researching, other companies can go in and buy those products and sell them at the market at a fraction of the cost. That is just not going to happen. No company is going to want to do that. Even if they stand up and tell us that the compulsory licensing will have to recoup the cost of research, we tell you that on an individual basis, individual competitors will not pay this cost. So we say that even if there's some kind of profit to be made from the research, it is the case that a company of equivalent size will be able to sell that product at a cheaper cost if they have compulsory licensing rights, because they haven't paid the cost of research. So they can afford to discount the product, drive that company out of the market, and think that it produced itself. That's how you destroy long-term innovation. We need a response on that point. No thanks, guys. Okay, so that dealt with, let's discuss the principle in this debate, right, which they just totally refused to engage with. We told you that it was completely unjust that property rights exist in practice only for the very biggest companies within the tech industry. No thanks, guys. We told you 3 reasons why this is the case. First of all, they cannot get patent bids because they're too expensive, because it's a limited supply, because the nature of the patent office is that it's very overworked and it's not supplied with enough stuff. Secondly, we told you small companies cannot get those patents because the appeals process works against them, and endless litigation suits from companies who are much bigger, who have much bigger legal teams, eventually almost always force them out of keeping that patent. Thirdly, we tell you that they put these companies under duress and coerce them into selling on the patents at cheap prices that are highly unfair because they suggest that they won't be able to keep the patents against the endless litigations coming from companies like Apple and Samsung. Yes?
You just described how compulsory licensing stifles innovation because the risk is bigger. Isn't that entirely what we are saying our entire case?
Okay, so guys, your solution doesn't work. You just have all of the harms we've talked about in the first instance about principles and practicalities, but I'm going to show later in the speech why you don't solve long-term innovation either, right? We told you a variety of things about why this mattered. It matters in society that if somebody comes up with an idea, puts work into that idea, generates wealth through generating intellectual property, that it is highly unfair. Something arbitrary like having lots of money in your company determines whether you get to keep that property or not. We said that was highly unfair. We would like a response, Team Estonia, in the next speech. Moving on then, no thanks, to the key thing in this debate that they wanted to talk about, which is long-term innovation. Let's see what they brought you, right? They said that there's no incentive to innovate on our side of the house, which you've already responded to because of compulsory licensing. And we'll compare that with our side of the house in a moment. They also told us, interestingly, that there's no incentive for the other companies who then take these ideas to do anything with these ideas. That is completely bogus, right? We tell you, first of all, that there is a competition effect, because now the original company and any company who wants to develop these products is able to sell those products, so they sell them much more cheaply to the market. That benefits consumers. But furthermore, we told you that there's competition to innovate in a derivative sense. In the first speech, Ariana told you how a lot of the time ideas allow new ideas to form. So, for an example of this, right, we couldn't have developed fingerprint technology for opening iPhones unless we had touchscreen technology in the first instance, right? We said that companies are now likely to compete in innovating in these areas, whereas previously, if Apple held a monopoly, it would have been possible to release these technologies in a very incremental way, which would have benefited people at a lot slower rate and would have been highly unfair to them. Let's tell you what we bring you on long-term innovation, right, in our substantive case, about boosting the long-term capacity of the economy to do this. Two things, right? First of all, how big companies respond, and secondly, how startups respond. And we're explicitly comparing here with the concept of compulsory licensing. No thanks. Large companies. First of all, they have an element of prestige, right? We say prestige arises when you're seen as being at the cutting edge of the industry, that you're making progress in that industry, because it's appealing as a narrative to shareholders and consumers alike to see that you're taking risks, that you're making progress, and you're the mark of quality, the seal of quality within that industry. We say this is highly important for business models of companies like Apple and Samsung, because it doesn't just benefit the product line that you're now releasing, it benefits all of your product lines. See Apple, when they released the iPad, there were increases in sales for all of their other product lines, like MacBooks and iPhones also, because the entire company was seen as being innovative and seen as being beneficial in that sense. So we say that therefore prestige is acquired under the status quo if you make even incremental innovations, because you're the only person who can innovate. On our side of the house, because suddenly it is possible to acquire all the current patents that exist, use these technologies to innovate in a derivative sense and improve on them. I'll take you in a moment. It is therefore possible to it's therefore only possible to retain prestige and all of the benefits of that for your business model if you innovate in the most aggressive sense and make conceptual leaps rather than incremental improvements in your products. Yes.
Long-term innovation matters in most important stuff, such as green technology and IBM's like synthetic brain, right? Prestige in those instances doesn't matter. Companies only look for the most effective and cheapest product. They really do not care about what green technology brand they use. They just want the cheapest product for the most effective price.
So some people think that. Other people think that, well, it's also important to know how good the company that produces this product is. Okay, cheapness is one thing, but there's an element of trust when you buy products. People trust Apple to give them good quality products because they're seen as innovative and they're seen as having prestige. Secondly, reverse engineering, and this is what they tell us, right? There'll be trade secrets. We agree. In most cases, they will just keep these patents hidden, right? First of all, we say that reverse engineering is a process where you take a product apart to learn about and copy the unique elements which make it tick. Two things to consider. First of all, absolute innovation increases because it is the case that reverse engineering is much harder for a product which is conceptually different from anything that's come before than from an incremental improvement. It's really easy to reverse engineer and release a near replica of the iPhone 5 within days because other companies already know what the iPhone 4 looks like and their designs are very similar, so you can compare very easily. By contrast, making major innovations as big companies can with all of the capital that they have is harder to reverse engineer. So you have a longer period of first mover advantage where you are able to sell the product exclusively and therefore recoup your losses. Secondly, there's an increase in the proliferation of these products because even if reverse engineering takes a year or two in our side of the house, that is still faster than the 20 years until the patent expires, by which point nobody wants that product, so competition doesn't happen. Secondly, startups are freed up to innovate in more ways, whereas currently they're being shut out of the patent market entirely because frankly they cannot keep patents and so they have no incentive to innovate. Ladies and gentlemen, this matters so much because in sub-Saharan Africa, businesses desperately need more advanced software, which is cheaper, in order to increase the consumer market they have and enrich themselves and their communities. Hospitals could do with better technology to save lives and end human suffering. We tell you that we boost long-term innovation in a sustained and accelerated way. Given that that was the entirety of their case, we say we're already well ahead in this debate. That is why we are so proud to propose today.
Thank you, Jared, for your speech. Your speaking time was 8 minutes and 8 seconds. Please welcome Carl, the first speaker of the second? Oh, really? Second speaker of the opposition.
companies like Apple and Samsung don't solve global problems that are going to affect us in 10, 50, and 100 years. Problems like global warming, which we currently lack solutions to tackle, things like people dying in millions to cancer, things that Apple and Samsung doesn't help us improve. We think that these are the things they're going to lose under their plan. We might concede that they're going to get cheaper smartphones within 10 years, but we think that even that benefit is going to diminish over time, right? We think there's no use of upholding a principle in this debate, as they've claimed, right? Quite frankly, we think that property rights only have like an instrumental value. And unless they manage to prove us that upholding that principle gives us more long-term innovation that is actually going to be meaningful, they're going to lose this debate. I'm going to do several things in my speech. Firstly, talk about the area of rebuttal about abuse, and then 3 points. Like firstly, risk of companies. Secondly, how much information they're going to have. And thirdly, extend our case. Talk about the capacity to invest into research and development. And even if like all of what we've said before doesn't stand, we still think we're going to have less innovation in the long term. Starting with abuse, which is basically the crux of their case, right? What they tell us is that rich companies have an advantage in terms of litigation and in terms of getting patents because they have more money. This is also the case in any other area of law or any other area of life in general. We don't think we should, create specific laws for rich people or deny them legal protection just because they have money to pay for lawyers. No, thank you. Secondly, we don't think that's the fault of the patent system. The problem they describe is expensive litigation and the expensive system of applying for patents. We support changing these things, right? No, thank you. We think that even with the propositions model, you can still, go to court if you're a rich company. Apple and Samsung didn't went to court for patents. They went to court for industrial design. These are the things that are going to remain. And predatory companies are going to be predatory, no matter whether they have patent protection or not. Unless they prove us that this power balance is extremely harmful innovation, we think that it holds no ground, right? Secondly, they tell us that companies hoard patents. Firstly, we don't think you need significant market share for this, to hoard patents. We've seen that most of the startups they've been talking about are predatorized by small patent trolls, very small entities that aren't companies with significant market share. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a reality check. Google, one of the biggest owners of patents in technology, has actively stepped out against patent abuse, right? We see like lots of companies are continuing with that trend. They're not that predatory, right? It doesn't make sense for them. We've seen it with Apple and Samsung. If Apple goes to court with Samsung, Samsung is going to retaliate. It doesn't make sense for them to be that abusive. Secondly, we told you about compulsory licensing, right? For example, British Petroleum is currently in court and they're losing in court for holding green technology patents. And the thing is that a very small startup actually sued them, right? Which shows that we have current mechanisms that can deal with these predators. No, thank you. They never respond to that. They concede to our point, right? We have more examples. We've gotten compulsory licenses from Microsoft, Intel, and Bayern. These are extremely rich companies, one of the most richest and most powerful in the world, right? Thirdly, we think they need to prove us that why a blanket policy is justified if not all companies have hoarded patents or abused them adversely. No, thank you. Let's have a reality check. We think it's totally possible in today's world to innovate, to enter the market. For example, let's take the smartphone industry they are so keen upon, right? Companies like Xiaomi and OnePlus, they're eating away Samsung market share. Samsung is one of the biggest companies with the most market share currently in the smartphone industry. These other startups, they're small companies that started less than 5 years ago. They have managed to climb through that and become very successful companies with significant market share, right? OnePlus, for example, was named the best phone of the year last year. So we think it's possible to get patents also for startups. We're talking about companies that have become extremely successful. Companies like Nest and Pebble, very small companies that don't have significant resources. Furthermore, we think that even if the point about the abuse is true, we think that our long-term harms are going to outweigh that. That's exactly what I'd like to continue.
On this point.
No, thank you. Talking about risk, right? What we basically told you is that you as a company are now less likely to succeed with your investment to research and development because you can be copied. Your first mover's advantage is going to be hindered. There's less use of your prestige if you're Apple, if someone can straight out copy your product. They even talked about abolishing copyright protection, which means that, there can literally be the same phone that as Apple is producing, just with a quarter of that price. No, thank you. What Team Proposition tells us is that companies are still going to innovate because they want to keep their prestige. We think this is true, but they're still going to be more powerful than other companies, right? They don't need to develop self-driving cars or nanoparticle cancer detection, things that Google is doing currently, because they have no guarantee that someone else isn't going to copy them. No, thank you. They actually gave us no answer to our point about. Never mind. Moving on to the point of information, but before I continue, go.
Both sides agree to break up monopolies because they have too much power to inflate prices and prevent other companies from joining the market. Tell us how this is disanalogous from the current patent system.
Yes, all of my analysis about companies can currently enter the technology market, how monopolies virtually don't exist. One of the most important technology companies, Google, you still have alternatives, right? The only area where Google is holding back innovation is the area where they have trade secrets in place. They're search engine, right? Patents don't matter in these instances. No, thank you. Quickly, talk about information. What we told you is that companies want to protect their intellectual property no matter what. They're going to resort to trade secrets. For example, Apple's A9 chip, which is used in iPhones, is not patented, it's protected by a trade secret. This is one of the best chips in the phone industry, and no one knows how it's made, right? This is going to happen with all areas. If they are going to lose patent protection, it's going to become so much worse. For example, 80% of all the current technology information is only in the patent registries. This is the information they're going to lose. And here comes to play their own argument. They tell us that, companies, basically startups, can now build upon existing ideas once they come public domain. That's the thing. Maybe in 5 years' time they're going to achieve a small benefit, but in 10 years you're not going to have any information to build upon in the first place, right? That's the thing they need to answer to. They tell us that companies are going to reverse engineer and still become successful. We think that firstly it's impossible in terms of software. You simply you can't do that. Secondly, we think it's going to be more expensive than currently dealing with the patent cost, right? To reverse engineer everything. And finally, if reverse engineering is so easy, why do we need to plan in the first place? Extending our case, talking about capacity, we think that in simple terms, big companies are going to have less money, so even if they want to innovate, even if they want to keep their prestige, they're simply going to have less resources to do that. Fairly simple. 3 mechanisms why they're going to have less money. Firstly, because they can't license their patents out anymore. For example, Nokia earned €500 million last year just for patent licensing. Secondly, more importantly, you can't sell your patents. You basically can't get reward for your innovation anymore, or you get less reward. For example, the technology company Northfield sold their patents for $4.5 billion. And thirdly, you can't charge a premium anymore, right? Your products have to be cheaper because there are always going to be other competitors that are willing to do that. We think that by empowering weaker companies artificially, these companies are cannibalizing their own success in the long term. They're going to attack the companies that are the very premise for innovation because they have the most resources and know-how. For these reasons, I'm extremely happy to oppose.
Thank you, Carl, for your speech. Your speaking time was 8 minutes and 10 seconds. I'd now like to call Amani to give your speech.
Imagine owning technology that could constantly monitor your heart rate and alert paramedics with your exact location if it detected an anomaly. This technology was invented by Apple 8 years ago. And not only has Apple refused to release it ever since then, but it has systematically sued every developer and company who's attempted to further develop it and who's tried to buy the license to produce it off of Apple. This was the kind of world team proposition highlighted for you at the start of the debate. We urge team opposition to argue on our grounds and tell us how they're benefiting consumers more, and tell us how they're that they're ensuring that these small companies will be able to innovate and that more products will be able to enter your market, and that eventually, overall, we will be creating a world in which you have small companies and large companies being able to innovate at an equal pace. With that, 3 issues today. Firstly, I'll be talking to you about small companies and how they're benefiting under our policy. Secondly, I'll be talking to you about large companies and how they're also benefiting and innovating under our policy. And lastly, I'll be talking to you about consumers and the benefits we highlighted for you today. Let's start off with small companies. One problem here, they said compulsory licensing is something we support. This is something that's really good. They also said we support that monopolies should be broken up. Let's firstly tackle this, right, and show you how they never won this argument simply with that principle. Firstly, clearly they don't care about property rights, that's fine, right? So they accept our principle, and they accept that if there's significant harms, your government can in some cases break up these monopolies, or in their case, introduce compulsory licensing, right?
Point malformation.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, they have to then show to us how the same chilling effect won't exist if a large company knows that its patents can be compulsorily licensed and taken away from them at any single point. They have to show to us how these large companies will still have an incentive to innovate if they know that if they become too big and start patent hoarding, the government will take their patents away from them. Ladies and gentlemen, their case never stood to begin with. Right? And secondly, we feel if we're able to show to you how these harms exist, which we consistently did, and we asked them to tackle this, right? We talked to you about patent meshes and how these exist, which is what stifles small companies. Because if I, an independent researcher who's graduated from Harvard, decide to come up with an idea, and I realize, wait, there are already 15,000 patents that exist from my idea, I feel I'm not really able to break through the market. So what's my only alternative then? Going to these large companies, right? Or I choose to apply for a patent, which I can't really do because the patent system is extremely hard, and because these large companies have so much more power in the patent system because of the fact that they have large capital. And thirdly, I said we talked about how these small consumers are exploited because of the fact that these large companies are able to manipulate them and, no thank you sir, for instance, and they break non-disclosure agreements, steal their ideas, and then they're never really able to fight them in court because of the fact that they have more money. Second thing they said within this issue, startups are already booming, we don't need this. They gave us examples of XYZ big startups that have succeeded and how OnePlus was a famous phone last year, right? Firstly, giving us 5 examples of startups around the world that have actually succeeded isn't really a fair example. Secondly, we feel majority of the startups that actually reach a certain point, like Instagram, like Picasso, like millions of startups that have been bought up by large companies this year, don't really succeed beyond a certain point. So they're able to innovate to a certain point, after which they realize there are too many obstacles in the course of their innovation because these large companies have bought up all the patents and now they can't really innovate anymore. And this is where we contextualize the problem, right? Because now what happens is that these small companies don't have any other choice except to go and be bought up by these large companies, which is what has been consistently happening, ladies and gentlemen. 63% of the startups over the last 5 years have been bought up by giants such as Apple, HTC, Google, and we feel, no thank you sir, that is something that they have to tackle. They cannot give us 3 examples and think that it exists. Third thing they said within this, predatory companies will still be predatory and this will still exist. Show us how that is wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, the only reason these companies are predatory or that they have the tools to be predatory is because they have this army of patents, right, which they use to defend themselves with. If we take this army and this arsenal away from them, they will not be able to be predatory because because you cannot go and sue somebody else if you really have no claim over what they're making. They said, ladies and gentlemen, copyright laws still exist. We feel if our model applies to that, we will take away copyright laws. They cannot use that as a legitimate defense. Furthermore, we feel if anti-competition laws exist, and if these companies are copying entire products and you're going to be able to sue them under your model, we feel this doesn't really happen because you can still, no thank you sir, you can still have derivative innovation happening under our model and these companies copying phones and doing incremental improvement and releasing it to the public. Before I move on to my second issue about how large companies will innovate, I will take a PO.
When Google buys up small startups, these startups receive funding, know-how, distribution platforms. These are the things that make it better for the consumer. What use is a startup that products I can't buy in a
So when
regular
Google
store?
buys, thank you sir. So when Google buys up a startup, what essentially happens is that Google now has control over what the startup does. So basically that startup becomes a part of Google. Show us how that is good for the consumer, because our entire argument is about how these large companies will actively harm your consumer. So we don't care if Instagram has been bought up by Facebook, because if Facebook is not achieving the benefits we want to at the end of the day, our argument still stands. That does not. Large companies, right? They said long-term innovation will not really take place. No, thank you, sir. First movers advantage. Their ideas will be copied, so they won't innovate, right? So for one reason, show us why this will still happen, right? Because my second speaker's entire argument was about how these companies have prestige, right? And how they have first mover advantage within this market. He came and gave you the example of how even though you have many companies still making smartphones in today's world, Apple still has the largest market share simply because of the fact that it was the first person to break through into the market of this kind of technology. He said now you will have more innovation because now when Apple is hoarding 15 different iPhones within their shelves in Palo Alto, Apple will now not be incentivized to make incremental improvements and introduce the iPhone 6A, 6B, 6C. Instead, Apple will say, let's make a new breakthrough technology. It's extremely petty and naive of them to come up here and say that these super large companies with huge market shares and huge profit motives will simply stop innovating under their model. They never substantiated upon that. It was a simple assertion. Our argument still stands. They said these companies have more resources and know-how, and that's going to benefit you in the long run. We say, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Zuckerberg was able to dream up a Facebook in his dorm room. We don't think more resources is necessarily means you'll be able to innovate at a greater pace. We feel you'll be able to innovate at a greater pace if you don't have these large companies stalking you and destroying your every move to enter the market, and that's how we are ensuring innovation. That doesn't stand. Third thing they said, no, thank you, sir. They talked about trade secrets and talked about licensing. We said this already happens, right? And they said no, 30% of the information is actually available in these patents. Factually incorrect, ladies and gentlemen. These patents are extremely vague. Show us how Apple patent in the fifth dimension has 30% of the information within that patent. That doesn't really stand, right? And we feel they will eventually release these things. They will eventually release these secret chips. They will be in the market because these large companies have a profit motive to eventually benefit from them, and small companies will be able to make incremental improvements and innovate more, right? Lastly, talk to you about consumers. And now let's deal with this. Not only did side opposition not really care about consumers in this debate, but they disregarded the benefit of this to developing countries, right? And on developed countries as well. So let's talk about the benefit we offer you. When you break up these monopolies, when you take away their patent protection, you will now have cheaper things within your market. Yes, a phone that costs $100 less does matter to a person living in Somalia or Pakistan, right? And we feel you will have better quality things because you will have more competition within your playing field. As a result of which, this will not only boost your economy, but it will benefit consumers all around the world. It will also increase innovation. And for all these reasons, and because our arguments still stand, we have won this debate.
Thank you, Mark, for your speech. Your speaking time was 8 minutes and 12 seconds. I'd now like to call Vicky to give her speech.
According to patent
patent theory, patents have two main purposes. First of all, the incentive is to incentivize innovation. Secondly, to spread and make available more information. We think that we don't have to distribute patents or intellectual property in general equally. We have to distribute in any way that is necessary, that incentivizes innovation and gives us a better world, say in 20 years, but also in the short term as well. What the proposition has given us is lots of examples how in some instances the system can be abused. We think that this does not necessarily warrant a blanket response in every case. We want to prove to you that the harms that come with their policy are long-term, big, and more important, whereas the harms that they bring out are rather minuscule and can be dealt with otherwise. First of all, I'll talk about abuse and how we can deal with it without requiring this response. And secondly, I'll talk about innovation and why this is actually what matters. First of all, about abuse. First of all, they tell us that startups can now get access to buying patents. Currently, they cannot. First of all, their reason basically is that patents are expensive. This does not warrant such a response, let's make them cheaper. But the point, and bigger point, is that even if you can't make them cheaper, and under their model, small companies or startups will get access to more patents, we think that there will be no use of these patents for them. Because if we talk about startups, and if we talk about Mark Zuckerberg, who did this in his basement, then these people will never have the money and the funds to actually bring their projects to fruition. The only reason Mark Zuckerberg did is because he got an investment, and that's the point that we're talking about. Now, under their model, the moment a big company buys out a small one, these patents become public domain, which means that big company loses this edge. This means that big companies, as they said, are less likely to buy out these small ones. And that means that these cool ideas, like Mark Zuckerberg's, like Waze, like Nest, are unlikely to ever get into the market at all, because these small companies can't afford them to do that themselves. So we lose out on all the potential nice and great ideas that startups currently have, and then Google incorporates them into their network. The way Nest became a big thing, and smart homes in general became a bigger thing because Google wanted to take them on. The way Waze became more approachable to most people. This will not happen under their case because big companies are unlikely to buy huge amounts of innovation. They lose out on that. Yeah, sure, somebody.
Show us how these large companies will still have an incentive to innovate if you're introducing the policy of compulsory licensing.
That's brilliant, because their whole policy of compulsory licensing, you explained our point. If they lose out on risk, they're less likely to innovate. But then they themselves said that hoarding patents makes it really difficult for you because then you get sued. The conclusion is that they won't hoard patents anymore, exactly the problem that they are saying that currently happens. So they themselves proved to us that hoarding patents will not be a problem because these very companies don't want to get sued. Really nice, thanks. Okay, so moving on to the next point. They tell us that small companies are exploited and kept from the market. First of all, we already see that it's not necessarily true. You have small companies who get on the market, like a small startup that can sue BP, which is huge, or like OnePlus getting onto the market. They don't necessarily show us what we are really largely losing out. So on this small comparative, we sort of win. But secondly, and more importantly, we think that even if we will concede that there will be a few less small companies on the market under our case, they have to prove to us why particularly these few less small companies that we're losing are the winning sources of innovation. Because if these small companies cannot even afford to license out patents, it's unlikely that they will have the money or the know-how to bring us meaningful innovation, so we're not really losing that much. But what we are losing is that the big companies are actually the biggest sources of innovation, because big cool things like AI or cancer detection microchips are never something that a small company could even afford to do. Big innovation comes from these big companies, and they are less likely to be able to do that because of all the analysis we've brought. If they want to win this debate on innovation, they will have to prove to us how these small, few, minuscule companies that lose out in our case are the biggest source of innovation. We just don't believe that. That last point, they say that these big companies keep technology to themselves and don't use them. As I explained already, if we use compulsory licensing, then it's very likely that these patent hoarders are going to be sued for these patents, which means that they're unlikely to hoard patents in the first place and play fairly. We think that this has already happened with Microsoft and Bayern, and we think that if they say that Apple is doing that with that one thing, then we can also do that to Apple and make sure that this information is public. We don't say that you can use compulsory licensing always. You can use compulsory licensing when a company is very clearly has a patent but refuses to use that. That's the specific instance where that happens. So on this side, we also say all of these technicalities that they nitpick out of this system can be solved with other means or are not as important in the bigger picture. Secondly, the big picture, why we get more innovation. First of all, they tell us that prices will go down and that is good. First of all, we think that the technology that we have right now is in the middle of a development process. We think that technology that we potentially could get, say, in 50 years is the technology that we need. The technology we have right now won't solve global warming, it won't solve poverty, but we might lose out on technology that has. We think that's more important than right now a few people getting some cheaper iPhones. But secondly, we think that innovation also lowers prices, because the more you innovate, the cheaper it becomes for you to make stuff, the more you have competition, the more it lowers prices. So even under their scenario, getting lower prices, we get it as well. Yes.
So to clarify, on one hand, you're saying that last year OnePlus, a small company, was the biggest startup and startups are successful. On the other hand, you're asking us to prove how small, minuscule companies will be the biggest source of innovation.
Okay, first of all, OnePlus was not a startup, it was a medium-sized company. Secondly, that fact that we have one example of something that does work does not mean that there are also thousands of examples where it didn't work and it didn't get anywhere. They need to prove it's systematic. We don't. Second point, they say that people will still innovate because of prestige. First of all, that only applies to Apple and Samsung, for whom prestige is the main source. And for these companies, you don't need to make self-driving cars. People will still buy if you have small improvements, so you don't get major stuff out of there. But more importantly, this is not true in the case where stuff is sold that don't have brand value, like green technology. Probably nobody here can name a single green technology company. There, what matters is cheap price and quality. The quality will be the same because they'll be able to, like under their model, use the same model, but they are going to be lose out on prices, which means that their risk to innovate is a lot bigger. That means they're less likely to innovate. We get huge loss on that one. But lastly, they say that we can build on other stuff, and that is the main thing that they've missed in our debate. They say we can reverse engineer these trade secrets and then we can use the same thing. We cannot reverse engineer like Apple's microchip right now, and it's likely that companies will increase their security, so reverse engineering is quite likely not going to happen in all cases. What this means is that all of this information that currently is at the basis of innovation in those patent registries is not going to be accessible anymore, which means that nobody can build on anything. Nobody can use this information to actually direct their own research. This means that in the long term, none of these small or medium or any companies will be able to build or do meaningful innovation, because the premise of that is that you have something to look on and something to be inspired by. This will lose out a huge amount of innovation, and on this, we win this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, for your speech. Your speaking time was 8 minutes and 40 seconds. It's now a pleasure to ask Tano to give the opposition's replies to each speaker.
Two huge issues with Team Naz's case. Sorry, three. First of all, they don't accept the framework of the most realistic impacts in this debate. They frame this debate around Apple, about we need cheaper iPhones, we need people in developing countries to have cheaper iPhones. There are nearly 20 companies who are big majority shareholders in the phone market today. How many do you need to have exactly more competition? Do you need 50? Do you need 100? Right? We think in the most realistic case of what will impact the world in the most tremendous way, what will bring us the most benefits, is things like green technology, is things like artificial intelligence. Those are things which you extensively talk about in this debate, and they choose to ignore it. They systematically choose to ignore it, and they never respond to the point about Google, how will not innovate, or like huge projects, because they just will not have shareholder interest to do that type of stuff. Or IBM, the synthetic brains, right? All that type of stuff is something that's going to be immensely hindered, right? But secondly, an issue of trade. They tell us like this is so horrible. Everything in this world today, due to the patent system, is horrible. We have the biggest boom of small companies entering markets today in the world. We think it's quite obvious that the patent system has some flaws, but it's quite likely that companies can come in, use their minds, and innovate on new stuff. It's not an inherent problem that companies buy them out. They never show that harm. We have shown you that it's more likely to be better for the consumer. The second problem, the property rights point, right? We think they never substantiate it in its entirety. We think that that argumentation relies on the fact that something is going to be better. E.g., like most moral principles in the world are contingent on the fact that something will be better. So that point is entirely irrelevant in this debate. So we just have to look at it from the point of innovation, because patents have two primary functions, and that is to provide innovation and to provide information to be spread to the world. Let's look at innovation and then justification. What has happened in this debate, right? So innovation, incentive, they conceded that. They said compulsory licensing removes your money, so you do not want to innovate anymore. Like, let's be realistic. If that analysis is true, compulsory licensing already exists, and it has not damaged like most of the innovation as well. The reason why the comparative is different is, via compulsory licensing, you get the share of the profits you are forced to license to a certain company. For example, 10 till 50%. Under their narrative, you get no profit whatsoever. You get nothing. You have to give your patent away. You get nothing in return for that. So your reward is virtually zero, comparatively with the fact of having compulsory licensing, where you do get some form of reward, and you do not give it to the whole wide world. You give it to some certain companies, such as how Microsoft was forced, and Intel, which are also examples they never rebut in this debate, was forced to give out their certain patents to certain companies. We think this example stands. Secondly, information sharing. Something they yet again concede, because the simple matter of fact, information is necessary to innovate. Something the second speaker said. Yes, exactly. Problem though is, you're not going to have information available. They say trade secrets can be reverse engineered. We gave you examples of how we can't reverse engineer Google's search engine algorithm. We can't reverse the iPhone chip. It's extremely costly to reverse engineer 2,500 different pieces of technology in a single smartphone, rather than licensing out those patents, for example, from a certain company, or innovating them yourself. The comparative is quite different. Thirdly, small companies are going to be better off for the simple reason of fact that yes, they're going to be bought out, but if their end criteria is the consumer in this debate, well, then they're going to be better off, because you're going to get more products on the general market, because people use Google and they use the services that come with Google. Therefore, you're going to have more products on the general market, rather than a small startup with 15,000 likes on Facebook, which you will never find, right? Comparative, entirely different. Talking about justification quickly, we place them a burden. Show that it is systematic. Show that and before that, they never respond to the point that Carl gave you about capacity. We think that's also important, and we think if these companies literally have no money, they will not innovate. But quickly, so in terms of that, they had to show us a systematic trend. They had to show a systematic trend of how companies abuse the system entirely, and you can't come into the market. They pointed out, they gave us this POI about OnePlus, right? OnePlus was an exact example of a company using the patent system today to its advantage and coming into the market. Obviously, this can work, and unless it applies to every single instance that they talk about, this is an unjustifiable measure, and we think this measure should be stopped. For all of those reasons, I'm extremely happy to oppose.
thank you, John, for your speech. Your speaking time was 4 minutes and 28 seconds. It's now a pleasure to ask David to finish this debate and give the propositions reply speech.
In this reply, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk about property rights, I'm going to talk about short-term impacts, and I'm going to talk about the long-term world. But before that, I'd like to point out that Team Estonia have been, quite frankly, a walking contradiction in this debate. They told us, right, that compulsory licensing was in their model right from the start, but then they vacillated when they realised it was contradictory to their entire case, and then in the third speech it was on a case-by-case basis. That was totally unclear and contradictory. It was a team which brought a significant number of examples instead of analysis in their first speech, and then chastised us for bringing a single one, right? Totally inconsistent, totally shifting positions in response to individual questions. By contrast, Team Wales was far clearer. Let's go. First of all, property rights. We gave you three reasons why effectively the property of poorer and smaller companies was being stolen by bigger companies through the use of patent offices, inadequacies, and through the use of a legal system which cannot be reformed as they claim that it could be. We told you, right, that this was not an acceptable situation where if you generate an idea through hard work and through your ability, you've not received any kind of reward for the fruits of your labour. That was totally unfair. They first of all claimed that this was not important to the debate, but eventually they did engage with this. They said that it was fine because small companies can sell to larger ones, and that's fine. We tell you these transactions are coercive, right? These transactions are not free. It's like saying, fine, you can, I'll buy your house for $100, or I will sue you until I win the deed for the house and kick you out of the house and make you pay my legal fees. That's not a fair choice. That's not good enough. That's akin to theft, right? And then they told us, no, well, it's affecting too many companies that are not guilty of these things. It's unfair, it's a blanket ban. First of all, we tell you that we trust competition authorities to work out when it is justified, but even if that's not the case, we do care more about the major injustice with the outlined on our side of the house compared to a partial injustice for companies that are powerful enough not to have to worry too much about it. Secondly, let's look at the short-term world. They conceded this right from the start. They conceded that it was hugely beneficial that patents were now available to all sorts of companies. This meant prices would be driven down because companies would compete with each other and break up the virtual monopoly that exists when a company holds a patent in this way. That is incredibly important for increasing access to vital services, economically, socially, in terms of healthcare, for a variety of countries that were not wealthy, right? We care about the majority of people on the earth who haven't got $700 to pay for an iPhone, right? We care about making sure that technology is accessible to a wide range of people. So they pinned their entire case on the long term then, that we somehow made this world worse. We don't think this is the case. Let's look at their world. They told us about compulsory licensing. First of all, we analysed why this was less likely to incentivise innovation than reverse engineering, given that giving your ideas to another company immediately so that they can immediately start selling it is obviously much less attractive in terms of competition than having to wait 6 months or a year until they worked out how to reverse engineer it safely. That gave you more of an exclusive period to work on that product. There was no response to that. Then they vacillated. They told us that it would be on a case-by-case basis in the third opposition speech. We would say, fine, but that's still going to have an element of risk hanging over that company, which means they're just not going to innovate anymore, because at will, the government and the competition authorities can just take those patents away from them. That incentive is still not there. Lastly, in the reply, they told us that it's beneficial to have a share of the profits under compulsory licensing. So given that it was in the reply, I'll respond to it now, and we would say, right, that even if that's the case, because other companies are benefiting way more than you are, and given that it's a competitive market that companies don't want their competitors and rivals to benefit, there is still no reason to innovate. By contrast, we were clear that reverse engineering was our way of and prestige were our ways of ensuring that innovation would still happen. Maybe it would take a while to reverse engineer software, but it's very useful to know what the software does and how it is built. We tell you that even if this takes a long time, it's vital to strike a balance between making sure that companies keep innovating because they have a period of time where they have exclusive rights to produce, and then having a much more access to competition and the proliferation of these kind of developments to make sure that access is for a wide range of people within society. At the end of this debate, Team Estonia had no principle. They pinned everything on long-term innovation, and because they lost that point in the comparative through inconsistency and poor analysis, we are so proud to propose this motion today.